going to mute myself and then you guys can start.
Okay. All right, well, hello everyone. My name is Isadora Crushane. I'm a PhD candidate in Urban Studies and International Development at MIT, and I'm very excited to be here today with Professor Catherine D'Ignazio to talk about her book, Data Feminism, which was co-authored with Lauren Klein and published in 2020. Before we get to the book talk, I just wanted to take a few moments to introduce Catherine. So Catherine is an assistant professor of urban science and planning at MIT. She's also director of the Data and Plus Feminism Lab, which uses data and computational methods to work towards gender and racial equity, particularly as they relate to space and place. D'Ignazio is a scholar, artist, designer, and a hacker mama whose work focuses on feminist technology, data literacy, and civic engagement as pathways for which we can use data to build a more just and equitable society. And I say that that's very much the spirit of the book as well. For those who have not yet had an opportunity to read the book, Data Feminism is not simply the title of the book, but also a lens and set of principles through which we can think about how to approach data science in a way that understands that systemic inequalities and power asymmetries along gendered, racial, sexual, and class lines shape not only our world, but the data that we produce about it. And as Catherine and Lauren write in the book itself, data feminism is, and I quote, a way of thinking about data, both their uses and limits, that is informed by direct experience, by a commitment to action, and by intersectional feminist thought. So Catherine, the book is organized around 7 guiding principles: examine power, challenge power, elevate emotion and embodiment, rethink binaries and hierarchies, embrace pluralism, consider context, and make labor visible. And in discussing each of these principles in the book, you and Lauren not only seek to make existing biases in data science visible, but also show and elevate concrete practical examples of how to challenge this power differentials in society and advance data justice through grassroots activism. So I wanted us to start by your telling us a bit about what was your motivation for the book and how you developed these principles.
Sure. Thanks, Isa. And thank you also to the American Geographical Society for the invitation for today. So our motivation for writing the book really came about because of the narrative circulating at the time that the book was conceived. So this is like 5 to 7 years ago that I'm speaking about. And folks may have heard of this what is essentially a meme, but you have all probably heard it if you're following these conversations around big data, which is that data is the new oil, is how the meme goes. And we sort of pick on this one because it's very representative of these sort of techno-heroic sort of metaphors around data. So like data is the new oil, sort of first came out in the late 2000s, and then it was like kind of picked up and boosted by The Economist, the magazine. And if we think about it carefully, you know, there's a metaphor here being used of extraction, right? Mm-hmm. Because oil is an extractive industry. And in fact, many of the metaphors that we actually use as data scientists are extractive metaphors. So we extract, we mine, we process, we clean, we refine, you know, and ultimately it's about taking what is essentially kind of like natural raw material or supposedly natural raw material and converting it into value. And in the case of this sort of metaphor, and in many of these narratives circulating, it's really about profit. And yet, at the same time, that profit that is being generated from the data economy and the methods by which it is the data are extracted and used showcase these very profound asymmetries in who's actually benefiting from this quote unquote new oil. And so one of the wonderful things I think about the past, let's say 10 years of scholarship that I think actually we're in a place where geographers have also led in this space is around the emergence of critical data studies and a kind of critical pushback to these techno-heroic, and I would add very like sort of masculine narratives about what is the power and potential of data and technology. And so Lauren and I were really inspired by that, by this emerging scholarship and here I'm thinking of folks like Virginia Eubanks, Sophia Noble, Kathy O'Neill, Joy Bolamwini, folks are starting to say, in fact, data are not all that new, first of all, and our metaphors are not correct that we're using. In fact, what data are doing is exacerbating this kind of same old oppression that has always fallen along race and class and gendered lines. And in fact, might even be accelerating it and exacerbating it and kind of re-inscribing it into the world. So there's this way in which data are reproducing the same structural inequalities that already exist in important ways. And so Lauren and I felt like, okay, there's this moment here where there's a lot to be learned from bringing an intersectional feminist lens into this equation. It's kind of like, what can we learn from feminist theory, but very specifically intersectional feminist theory? What does that have to offer us in this current moment where data are so powerful and are being taken up by such powerful institutions? And what would data science look like if it were grounded in a kind of feminist lens? And so that's like the starting point for us. And the reason that we wrote the book was really this desire to say, what does an intersectional approach to data science look like, and how is it already made manifest in the world? Like, it's not this impossible vision that we could never realize. It actually is already happening. We just need to know where to look for it. So.
That's great. One of the aspects that I wanted to bring up as one of the really fascinating and commendable things about the book is that it really embodies and exemplifies a lot of these principles that you articulate in the book and that inspired your writing as well. Like, for example, embracing pluralism, like, is very apparent in the book by your bringing of different voices, citing a very inclusive body of scholarship, very different like references and citations. And I think that is particularly relevant at a moment in which academic institutions are really trying to be more inclusive and more diverse in how they define and develop their curriculum, their programs, and so forth. But the aspect that I thought was particularly cool and innovative about the book was like incorporating a participatory dimension into the writing. You put an early draft of the book online at a public platform where anybody could read it and provide comments. And you actually interacted with the users, responded to their comments and then suggestions. So I wondered if you could share a little bit more about what that process was like, just like, what was it like to put the work out there, to be held accountable in some ways, and how did you incorporate that back into the writing?
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so Lauren and I both felt strongly that we wanted our book and our process to sort of embody those same feminist principles that we are writing about and sort of advocating, and we have a normative stance, like this should be how things are done. And so we did a couple of things in this regard. So we actually we have a value statement, and we wrote that together that kind of guided the work. We actually audited ourselves. So we audited our citations for along the lines of like a variety of axes of oppression in terms of like, who are we citing, whose voices are we uplifting in the book. And then we had this open peer review process, and this was through MIT's platform PubPub, which is this open publishing platform that does versions of things. You publish a version and it can be open and people can comment on it and so on. And I have to say, the first time when this was actually, the press was at this moment where they were experimenting with the platform, and they came to us and they said, would you all want to put your draft up and put it up for public comment, in addition to doing like the regular peer review where like 3 or 4 people read the text and give you comments. And we talked about it, and I would say both of us had a lot of trepidation. This wasn't fully like, yay. We're like, we do have to think about this, because there's this way in which the work is not yet finished. It's like there's a draft, but it's not polished. It's not perfect. Not that it would ever be perfect, but so there was definitely this moment of anxiety of like, putting it out there. But then I think when we talked about it further, we felt like this really resonated with the principle of embracing pluralism. And so this is a kind of feminist approach, which we can trace back to feminist scholars of science, folks like Donna Haraway, Sandra Harding, who have advocated for a kind of idea of feminist objectivity, where instead of like, you know, one person creating some kind of universal truth, we actually pool our standpoints. So we bring diverse perspectives together into the equation and pool those. And through this more robust understanding of kind of where people are coming from and what they're advocating for, we ultimately arrive closer to what could be considered a objectivity, or maybe more like a consensual understanding of the truth or something. And so we felt like, okay, this is we should try this. And I'm very glad we did. We did have some fears about things like trolls and, you know, that kind of thing. Luckily, that did not come to pass. We put the draft up there. It was open for, I think, 3 months or so of comments. And we actually did architect some participation. So we invited colleagues to be peer reviewers of like individual chapters. And so that was the way we did very consciously architect some participation. And then we also had lots of participation that happened just from people finding it, sharing it, commenting on it. And we ran the gamut from everything from spelling mistakes. so like there was a lot of helpful copy editing. Yeah, and we were like, oh, okay, that's great. You know, like that was very helpful that they corrected our errors. But then we also had a number of people come in and say, well, yes, what about, you know, this citation, or what about this body of work? We had other people come in and say, well, you know, you're not being inclusive from a gender perspective. And so like, you know, kind of thinking about, and so like deep engaged critiques. We had, you know, it was interesting, it was online and you can go look at what people said. One of the very interesting things was that a lot of comments came in offline to us. So people emailed us separately. Actually, one person printed out the entire book as a paper and made extensive notes and then handed to me, to me one day. So I was like, this is amazing.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. And so I'm deeply grateful. You know, I would say on the back end, you know, if folks are considering doing something like this on the back end, then it made the revision process actually a lot harder, I would say, because we were dealing with many voices and they did not all agree necessarily with each other. There's just like a sheer volume of feedback that was a little bit hard to integrate. So we actually did a lot of rewriting and restructuring between the first draft and the final version, which I think a lot of that is due to the extensive nature of feedback that we received. But I have to say, I believe the work was strengthened so much between that first draft and the final version. And it gave us the real impetus that we needed to do that hard process of rewriting and restructuring, I think. Yes. And it was so helpful to see the ways in which the work wasn't communicating, actually. Like we thought in that first version, for example, our principles were very clear. And in fact, it turned out we could tell from people's comments they were not clear. So we were much more, I would say actually like kind of didactic in the final version to kind of really signpost a lot more like, here's where we are, here's what we're talking about, here's this very specific principle and that kind of thing. So yeah,
that's wonderful. Did you all also receive comments and suggestions from the people whose work you cover in the book that you describe, the activists? There are a lot of really interesting and concrete examples that you cover.
Yes. Yeah, well, we invited all of them, and I will say I actually conducted interviews with around 10 to 15 projects that we feature in the book, especially the ones that are kind of lengthier or that we have direct quotes from, because I wanted to be very careful that we were representing their project in a way that they agreed with. So yeah, in some cases, we reached out directly to those people to invite them to be these chapter reviewers, for example. Yes. And part of that too was, of course, to make sure, again, like on a kind of accountability thing, like to make sure that they were comfortable and on board with the way that we were framing their work. Because in some cases, I mean, we are doing in a way what I think academics do, which is like we're using these case studies and practice to then formulate new concepts or build on concepts. So concepts like missing data or counter data. And so, but we didn't want any person to feel like we're using their work or being extractive, basically. of their work. So yeah, so yeah, a number of those folks included the people themselves, as well as the scholarly work that we cite as well. We invited the scholars themselves in, so yeah.
That's great. Well, I wanted us to turn a bit attention to the theme of the American Geographical Society's event, which is Geography 2050 Toward a More Equitable Future, and talk about the intersections between data feminism and geography. So what do you see as the relevance of this book, for example, for our understanding of spatial dimensions of inequality? And how can it help us think through the role of spatial analysis and geography in building a more equitable future?
Yeah, thanks. So I'm thinking a lot about these questions right now. So in our department, I teach the GIS and spatial analysis course. And we've just this week actually been talking about ethics of mapping. And so I think there's many connections that I see. Like we wrote the book more broadly about data science. But there's very important ways that these discourses of data science, AI, and so on, definitely apply to geospatial data. And in a sense, almost needing to be more careful when we're talking about geospatial data and geospatial data science, because of the ways in which location information can be so sensitive and potentially exposing people to harm, depending on who's looking at where who is. So I think there's connections along the lines of geospatial data to all of our main concepts. So like in terms of thinking through like what are the power dynamics of like who produces the data, who produces geospatial data in particular, who has access to actually do something meaningful with that geospatial data, who can make maps and so on. But then on like the flip side of that, I think one of the really exciting things, so I think we have to ask what we call like, in the book, we frame these as who questions. Like basically we need to examine power and challenge power. Where we find power to be distributed unequally, we need to challenge power. And I think that certainly applies in relation to geospatial data and mapping. But yeah, like I said, on the flip side, one of the really interesting things about geospatial data and mapping in particular is I think it has a really long history of sort of civic engagement, participatory mapping, indigenous mapping, feminist mapping. All of these are already strands within mapping. So actually, I think I find that the discourse around power is actually further advanced in a space like geography. And that's actually where we saw a lot of the important work kind of defining the field of critical data studies coming from, because I think we've already had a lot of these conversations over, say, 40 years around how maps embed these structures of power, they reify these structures of power, and so on. And then I think the other important things we've seen a lot, especially in the past 20 years, of citizen-led projects that engage with mapping. So I'm thinking here specifically of like OpenStreetMap, for example, not without its, there's important critiques of OpenStreetMap, like I think of the work of Monica Stevens, for example, along the lines of gender. So it's not like it's this perfect example, but at the same time, I think it's a really interesting example of a kind of ground up production of infrastructural geospatial data. Like that is a really, I think, unique example of that, and continues to be a really vibrant community, which can be used in so many different ways. And then, I think there's a lot of activist mapping efforts as well. And so, the map is like a form that citizen groups and activist groups sort of turn to as a kind of first stage form of data visualization. And so I think we increasingly see and in fact, in the book, we feature a lot of examples of work that whether it's about eviction data or data about gender-based violence, street harassment, and all of these have chosen the map and have chosen spatial analysis as their preferred form of putting the data out there. So they're, I think, asserting that in these struggles to rectify the balance of power at some level, this is also about space. So this is also about space and place, and this is also about rectifying spatial inequalities at the same time as it might be about economic inequality, gender inequality, racial inequality, and so on. So I think that I find geography, and in particular sort of GIS and mapping, to be a really rich space, both for analyzing some of the problematics, but also for really looking to who's working towards more just solutions that are using data in a kind of more positive way. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. And I guess to conclude, I wanted to ask you how you're building on the data feminism framework in your current work and research, and where is that work going moving forward?
Yes, so we have a project, and Isa knows actually the answer to the question because we work together on a project called Data Against Feminicide. And so one of the cases I just mentioned, maps of gender-based violence. In data feminism, we feature the work of Maria Salguero, who is something of an activist or a person of civil society who has been mapping feminicide, gender-based killings in Mexico for now 5 years. And I was really fascinated by this example, and in fact interviewed Maria for the book, and now we've since interviewed her again for our project because of the I would say highly sophisticated ways in which she is gathering data that are not readily available from sort of institutional sources, assembling those data, publishing those data, sort of giving them out to activists, to NGOs, to data journalists. She actually has ended up amassing the largest public archive of feminicide in the Mexican context. And interestingly, because of this work producing this database, she has been invited to speak in front of Mexico's Congress several times. And so digging a little bit more into this, found that, and in fact, Maria's case is not unique. It's not like she's the only person who's doing this. In fact, there are a large number of citizen observatories, feminist collectives, data journalism organizations, and more, particularly in Latin America, but also in North America. We're looking at sort of both areas. And these are organizations that are scanning media reports. They are looking at institutional, official data sources, all as a way of trying to compile data about feminicide, so which may or may not, given the context, have legislation that defines it or frames it as a problem in some way. And a lot of this is a response to what you might call missing data. So like this is not a phenomenon that is adequately addressed or measured by the governments and the policies that are currently in place. So in any case, this is our current area of focus. We've been interviewing groups that are doing this monitoring, observatory data production work. And then we're also, we also build technology. So we have a design side of the Data Plus Feminism Lab. So we've been looking at how do we build tools to support exactly this kind of what we've been calling counter data science, to support citizen and civil society led groups to be able to work with data in this way, and really to use data as a tool for holding governments to account, to potentially raising public awareness and public consciousness around specific issues, and so on. And so that's sort of where we're at, and we've been developing these tools and building relationships with groups. So yeah, that's where we're headed.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine, and thank you all for engaging with this work. And we hope that you will take some time to read the book, which is a really wonderful book.
Thank you so much.
That was amazing.
Oh, good.
Oh my gosh, I have so many questions. That process that you mentioned, that sounds unbelievable and like necessary for going forward for every like publishing
Yeah.
purpose. That's just amazing that you did that. I can't wait to read this book. I'm so excited.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm actually like thinking towards writing my next book, and then I was like, but then the feelings of fear hit me again. I was like, oh man. But then in my head, I'm like, I have to do it though because the book will be so much better if I do it. So it's like I feel like I must do it, but then it's like I have that like heart thing.
Sounds tedious for sure, but like you're doing the work to make sure that the platform you have is being told correctly. So,
Exactly. Totally. Yeah.
well, thank you so much. Let me stop recording.